The Earth has a throat. It descends 7,257 feet into blackness, deeper than any known cavity on the planet, and at its bottom, something waits in water the color of infected flesh. They call it Veryovkina Cave. Pavel Demidov had explored its depths 17 times before that September morning in 2018, and 17 times he'd felt it, the sensation of being swallowed. The Gagra Mountains of the Georgian-Russian border held 4 of Earth's deepest caves, but Veryovkina was different. The others were merely holes. Veryovkina was alive. You feel it too, don't you? His teammate Andrei had asked once at Camp 3, surrounded by 4,000 feet of stone. The breathing. Pavel had nodded but said nothing. Experienced cavers knew better than to give voice to such thoughts. The mountain didn't need encouragement. The expedition began like the others. Pavel's team from the Perovo Speleo Club had done this dance before. The 4-day descent through increasingly impossible spaces, the camps established at intervals like breadcrumbs through a nightmare. With them this time were 2 photographers, Robbie Schoen and Jeff Wade, documenting what no camera had captured before, the true bottom of the world. The first day passed in the usual way, the grinding descent through passages that seemed designed to reject the human form, temperatures hovering just above freezing, water weeping from walls like the stone itself was perspiring. The darkness beyond their headlamps wasn't just absence of light. It was presence, thickness, something that pushed back. At Camp 1, installed permanently at 2,000 feet, Robbie made his first mistake. While adjusting his camera, he thought he saw movement in the shadows beyond the reach of their lights. Not animal movement, something fluid and wrong, like oil spreading across water. "Did you see that?" he asked Jeff. "See what?" Robbie said nothing more. Professional photographers don't spook easily, and he had no intention of looking foolish in front of these legendary Russian cavers. But he made a mental note of it, the shadow that moved against the light. By day 3, they'd reached Camp 6 at 6,900 feet. The camp sat in a wide horizontal passage, away from the main vertical shaft, or so they thought. The tunnel stretched into darkness in both directions, and Robbie couldn't shake the feeling that it was an artery, that they were insects crawling through something's vein. The temperature had dropped. Their breath crystallized in the air. And for the first time in any of his expeditions, Pavel noticed something odd about the limestone formations. They looked almost organic, like the calcified remains of something that had tried to climb out. On day 7, they made it to the bottom, the lake. Nothing had prepared Robbie for what he saw. Surrounded by walls of black limestone, the water glowed an impossible turquoise, not from any light source, but from within. Bioluminescence, perhaps, or some trick of mineral reflection. The lake measured 50 feet long, 25 feet wide, and 28 feet deep. At its deepest point, where it met the water table, their instruments detected something else. A hollow space below. A chamber that shouldn't exist. "This is wrong," one of the Russian cavers muttered in his native tongue. Pavel shot him a look that said, "Shut up," but Robbie had caught it. His rudimentary Russian was enough. Jeff was setting up his camera when he noticed it first. His lens was pointed at the lake, and in the viewfinder, he saw ripples. Perfect concentric circles spreading from the center. But the air was perfectly still. No one had touched the water. "Hey, Pavel." The radio crackled. A voice from Camp 3, distorted and urgent. "Storm on the surface. Flash flood warning. Water incoming." Pavel's expression didn't change, but Robbie saw his knuckles whiten around the radio handset. In caves this deep, floods were common, expected even. They'd planned for this. Camp 6 was elevated, away from the main shaft. They'd be fine. 30 minutes later, they heard it. A sound like a freight train in the distance, growing closer. The entire cave began to vibrate. Dust and small rocks rained from the ceiling. And then the water came. It didn't flow, it erupted. From the vertical shaft, a fire hose column of water exploded into their camp. The roar so loud it felt like being inside a jet engine. Robbie dropped his breakfast and ran from his tent, watching in awe as thousands of gallons per second poured into the depths below them. But Camp 6 remained dry. The water fell past them, filling the passages below. Pavel checked his instruments. The camp was safe. They'd wait it out. 2 hours later, one of the team members heard bubbling. It came from a small hole near the tents, barely noticeable, just a crack in the rock. The caver knelt, shined his light into it. Nothing, just the sound of water somewhere far below. He reported it anyway. Pavel listened, frowned, and decided to check the nearby siphon to monitor the water table. He took 2 others with him. They disappeared down a side passage. They returned 5 minutes later, white-faced. The team member looked at the hole again. This time water was visible, not seeping, surging, rising so fast it was splashing against the walls of the tiny cavity. In moments, it would overflow. The color drained from Pavel's face. "Get out," he said quietly. Then, louder, "Get out now!" The camp erupted into chaos. Robbie and Jeff threw on their latex suits, their abrasion-resistant nylon coveralls, their helmets and harnesses. Robbie stared at his cameras, $40,000 worth of equipment. He pulled the memory cards, stuffed them into a plastic bag, tucked it into his suit. Everything else would stay. As they scrambled toward the vertical ropes, Robbie noticed something that made his blood freeze. The black limestone walls were moving, not cracking or crumbling, moving, flexing, like the walls were made of muscle, not stone. He decided his mind was playing tricks. Had to be. Lack of sleep, too much stress, the primal fear of being trapped underground. The crossing to the ropes had been a narrow bridge over an 18-meter chamber. Earlier that day, the chamber had been empty air. Now it was a churning pool of water, level with the bridge. Black water. Opaque. And in that water, Robbie could swear he saw shapes. Not debris, shapes with purpose. At the rope, the waterfall hit them with the force of a physical assault. Robbie clipped his ascenders to the line, tucked his chin to create an air pocket, and began to climb. The water crushed down on him, suffocating, relentless. He focused on the white rope inches from his face and climbed mechanically, refusing to think about anything else. When he reached the narrow, shoulder-width hole in the rock, the source of the cascade, he thought he would die. The water pressure was too much. He could only move his ascenders an inch at a time. His arms burned, his lungs screamed, and in the roar of the water he heard something else. A voice. Not words, just sound. A tone that vibrated in his bones, beneath the frequency of hearing. It said, "Come down, come down, come down." He broke through the hole and kept climbing, not stopping even when he reached the dry section. Jeff's shouts finally brought him back to himself. They waited at Camp 5 for the others. Minutes stretched into hours. The cave continued shaking. Finally, a single headlamp appeared in the shaft below. Andrei emerged, his face slack. "I don't know if the others made it," he said. They sat in silence, contemplating the possibility that 6 men had just died in the flooded passages below. Then, impossibly, more lights appeared. One by one, the entire Parovo team climbed into Camp 5. One caver even carried a stove and 4 sleeping bags strapped to his harness. But something was wrong with them. Robbie could see it in their eyes. They'd seen something down there, in the submerged passages. None of them would talk about it. Pavel broke the silence with forced cheerfulness, herding everyone into a tent for coffee. The Russians laughed about the ordeal. Robbie couldn't laugh. He kept his gear on and stared at the shaft, watching for rising water. 61 meters above them was a horizontal passage they'd need to crawl through to escape. Normally it was half full of water. Now it would be completely submerged. A siphon dive with no equipment. If the water kept rising, they'd drown in their tent. For 16 hours they waited as the roar gradually diminished. The flood pulse lasted 20 hours total, the result of a week of rain followed by a single severe storm. Raindrops the size of nickels, a taxi driver later told them. When they finally ascended through the submerged passage, holding their breath and pulling themselves along the rope through complete darkness, Robbie felt the cave resist, felt it trying to hold them. The stone around him pulsed with a rhythm that matched no geological phenomenon he knew. They reached the surface on day 9, exhausted, traumatized, but alive. The expedition was written up as a success. New passages mapped, species sampled, photographs saved. Another triumph for the Parovo Speleo Club. Robbie never mentioned what he'd seen in the water, the shapes that watched them escape. Pavel never mentioned finding the symbols, deep in the flooded passages, carved into stone that should have been untouched for millions of years. He'd seen marks, not natural erosion, deliberate shapes, a language that predated language, and they'd been fresh, recently made, by something that still lived down there, 2 years past. The cave was studied, analyzed, celebrated as a geological wonder. Then, in November 2020, someone noticed a rope fixed at the cave's entrance. Unusual, dangerous. Anyone could climb down it without proper training. No one thought much of it. On August 4th, 2021, Pavel's team returned to Veryovkina. At 1,300 feet, they found climbing hardware that shouldn't exist. Crampons, an ice axe, equipment that couldn't have fallen into the cave naturally. Someone had gone down, far down. At 2,000 feet, they found the first camp disturbed. Someone had stayed there. At 3,200 feet, the second camp showed signs of occupation. Faces indicated someone had lived there for approximately a week. At 3,600 feet, they found Sergei Koziv. He was still clipped to the rope, still wearing his camouflage coveralls and hiking boots. His body had been decomposing for months in the cold, wet darkness. 2 phones in his pockets, no identification. But his face was wrong. Pavel had seen many corpses in his career as a cover and rescue specialist. He knew what decomposition looked like at different stages. Sergei's body showed the expected decay for the time frame and environment. But his face was contorted in an expression that didn't match simple hypothermia or exhaustion. It was a face frozen in the moment of seeing something impossible. The phones told the story. Sergei Kozev, 37, from Sochi, an avid solo adventurer. He'd spent nearly a year planning this unsanctioned expedition, collecting maps and data from the Parovo team's published expeditions. He'd told no one where he was going, not even his wife and children. He'd made it to Camp 2, lived there for a week, then descended toward Camp 3, where the cave becomes significantly wetter and more technical. He'd brought hand ascenders but no foot stirrups, meaning he had no way to climb back up the long vertical shafts. The official report said he'd become trapped by his own inexperience, died of hypothermia and exhaustion, unable to ascend. A tragic accident. But Pavel saw the messages on Sergei's phones before the authorities confiscated them. Text drafts never sent. The last one, time-stamped the day before his death. It's not a cave, it's a mouth. The lake at the bottom isn't water, it's an eye, and it's looking up. Another message, written hours later. The symbols on the walls are moving, changing. They're not in the stone. They are the stone. The cave is reorganizing itself. I can hear it thinking. The final message was a single word, typed over and over until the phone died. Ascending, 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 ascending. But Sergei hadn't been ascending when they found him. He'd been descending, his body face downward on the rope, heading deeper into the cave. Away from safety, towards something. It took over 100 people to recover his body. The decomposition gases in the confined space made it toxic. In the end, they had to dismember him to extract him through the narrow passages. Pavel supervised the operation personally. He needed to see something. And at the place where they'd found Sergei's body, he looked at the walls with a UV light he'd brought. The symbols were there, hundreds of them, glowing faintly in wavelengths the human eye couldn't normally detect. And as he watched, one of them changed, shifted, rearranged itself into a new configuration, a new message. Pavel photographed it, but the image came out corrupted. Static and digital artifacts obscured whatever had been there. He tried again. Same result. On the third attempt, his camera simply died. Battery drained from full charge to zero in an instant. He never told anyone what the symbol had said, but he understood it. Some messages transcend language. They bypass the conscious mind and write themselves directly into the hindbrain, into the parts of human cognition that remember when humanity was prey. The symbol had said, "Welcome back." Pavel hasn't returned to Veryovkina Cave since recovering Sergei's body. The Perovo Speleo Club continues to explore deep caves throughout the Gagra Range, setting new depth records, mapping new passages. But Pavel always finds reasons to decline expeditions to Veryovkina specifically. He tells colleagues he's getting too old, that his knees can't handle it anymore. They believe him because he's earned that right. The truth is simpler and more terrifying. Pavel knows what waits at the bottom of that cave. He's seen it, felt it. He knows that every expedition leaves something behind. Not equipment or supplies, but something else. Something invisible, a piece of the explorer that the cave collects, harvests. And he knows that Sergei didn't die of hypothermia. The autopsy report was clear. Cause of death was cardiac arrest brought on by extreme hypothermia. But Pavel had seen the autopsy photos. He'd seen what the medical examiner had written in the margins of his notes, and then crossed out. The observations that didn't make sense. Sergei's lungs had been full of water, but not regular water. This water contained mineral concentrations that matched no known source. And under microscopic analysis, the water contained something else. Microscopic structures that weren't quite crystalline, weren't quite organic. Structures that moved on their own, even after Sergei's body had been refrigerated for weeks. The medical examiner had called Pavel privately. "This is going to sound crazy," he'd said, "but I need to ask. Is there any chance Sergei drowned at the bottom of that cave? In that lake you mentioned?" "Impossible," Pavel had replied. "We found him at 3,600 feet. The lake is at 7,200 feet, and he was never deep enough to reach it. Then how did this water get in his lungs? Because according to my analysis, this water came from extreme depth. The mineral signature suggests exposure to pressures consistent with, well, with being over a mile underground." Pavel had no answer. Still doesn't. But he remembers standing at the edge of that turquoise lake during the 2018 expedition, looking down into water that glowed from within, and seeing, just for a moment, a ripple that moved against all physical laws, a ripple that climbed upward through the water column, defying gravity, a ripple that suggested something below was reaching up. Veryovkina Cave remains the deepest known cave on Earth. New expeditions probe its depths every year, pushing deeper, mapping further. The lake at the bottom has been measured precisely. The water table has been analyzed. Everything has been documented with scientific rigor, but science can't explain why every expedition to the lake reports the same phenomenon, a feeling of being watched from below, of something vast and patient waiting in depths that instruments claim don't exist. It can't explain why cameras consistently malfunction near the lake, why digital recordings develop that low-frequency hum that shouldn't be there. It can't explain why experienced cavers sometimes hear their names called from the darkness, in voices that sound like their own, beckoning them deeper, and it certainly can't explain the rope. In March 2024, another team descended to the lake. They were professional cave divers, equipped to explore the siphon passages that extend below the water table. They brought equipment to measure the depths below the known bottom of the cave. They sent a weighted line down with a depth measuring device attached. The line was 500 feet long, far longer than necessary, since the deepest projection models suggested maybe 40 feet of additional depth below the visible lake bottom. The weight never hit bottom. The entire 500 feet of line disappeared into the water, pulling tight. The device attached to the end transmitted data for 3 seconds before going silent. In those 3 seconds, it reported a depth of 2,147 feet, nearly half a mile of water below the bottom of the cave. Impossible, according to every geological survey. The cave couldn't extend that deep. The bedrock layer simply didn't allow it. The water table they were measuring was supposed to be the floor of the entire system. The team tried to recover their equipment. The line wouldn't budge. It was as if something below had grabbed it, had hooked it, was holding on. They cut the line and surfaced, reported their findings to the relevant geological institutions. The data was dismissed as instrument malfunction. The team was thanked for their efforts and politely discouraged from returning. But one member of that expedition, a geologist named Dr. Anya Volkov, couldn't let it go. She'd seen something during that dive. Something in the water below the lake caught in her helmet lamp for just an instant. A structure, geometric, deliberate. She went back alone 3 months later. Told no one. Used the same rope Sergei had fixed years before, still hanging at the entrance like an invitation. She never emerged. Her body has never been found. But 6 months after her disappearance, a spelunker at Camp 1 found something scratched into the wall with a sharp implement. Fresh scratches. Recent. The message read, "The depth keeps changing. We're being digested." Below it was a signature. AV Dr. Anya Volkov. The message had been made 3 months after she went missing. Pavel learned about this 2 weeks ago. He'd been contacted by Anya's sister, who'd been going through her research notes. Anya had sent her a file the day before she disappeared. A backup, she'd called it. Insurance. The file contained photographs. Hundreds of them, taken during previous expeditions by other teams. Some went back decades. All were images of the cave walls at various depths. Anya had organized them chronologically and overlaid them with geographic markers. The result was impossible to dismiss as camera malfunction or pareidolia. The cave was changing. Not eroding, changing. Passages that appeared in photographs from 2005 had different configurations in photos from 2015. Chambers had different dimensions. Rock formations had moved, not inches, meters, and the symbols. The glowing symbols that Pavel had found at Sergei's death site. They appeared in photos throughout the cave's history, but they were never in the same locations. They migrated, evolved. Anya's final note in the file read, "It's not a cave. Caves don't learn. Caves don't adapt. Whatever Veryovkina is, it's using us. Every expedition teaches it more about us, our patterns, our weaknesses, our fears. I think it's almost ready." Ready for what? She didn't say. Pavel sits in his apartment in Moscow now, 3 weeks after receiving that file. He hasn't told anyone, hasn't shared Anya's research. Who would believe it? And more importantly, what could be done even if people did believe? Close the cave? Seal the entrance? Pavel knows it wouldn't matter. The cave has other openings. It's been here for millions of years. It will be here millions of years after humanity is gone. And it's patient. So patient. His phone rings. It's Robbie Schoen, the photographer from the 2018 expedition. They haven't spoken in years. "Pavel, I need to talk to you about something. I've been having dreams about the cave every night for the past month. Always the same dream. I'm standing at the edge of that lake, and I can see shapes moving in the water. Shapes that look like people. Dozens of them. All the people who've died in that cave. And they're not dead. They're changing, becoming part of something. And in the dream, they all turn to look at me at once, and they say, 'Come home,'" Pavel finishes. They say, "Come home." Silence on the line. Then, "You've had the dream too." "Yes, so has Andrei. So has everyone from that expedition." I didn't want to mention it. Didn't want to sound insane. What does it mean? Pavel looks out his window at the Moscow skyline. Millions of people going about their lives, unaware that beneath the mountains far to the south, something ancient is waking up. Something that's been using the cave as a lure, as bait. "It means the cave isn't done with us," Pavel says finally. "Whatever lives down there, it marked us. And it's calling us back. What do we do?" Pavel has no answer, because he knows the truth. Even if he can't say it out loud, the dreams will get stronger, more insistent. One by one, they'll return to the cave. They won't be able to help themselves. The call will become too strong to resist. They'll descend into Veryovkina's throat. They'll reach the lake. They'll see what waits below, and they'll understand, finally, that the cave was never the deepest place on Earth. It was always just the doorway.